Her gaze seemed to tell others that she had long since seen through the world and had no attachments. This stark contrast between her age and her eyes made her appear both composed and possessing a unique, mature charm, as if she were not a young maid, but a woman who had weathered storms and seen the complexities of life. Ning Que knew well that Sang Sang's calm silence was just a facade. In his eyes, this little maid was merely a simple-minded girl who had grown accustomed to relying on him. After so many years of living together, she depended on him to handle everything, and as a result, had grown even more reluctant to think for herself. It was this reluctance that made her seem a bit slow, and to mask that slowness, she spoke very little, giving others an impression of aloofness and maturity. It's not clumsiness, it's stubbornness, Ning Que silently corrected himself, feeling a twinge of helplessness. After a long silence, Sang Sang suddenly looked up, biting her lip, showing a rare expression of apprehension, and whispered, "I heard. Chang'an is really big, with lots of people." "Yes, the capital is bustling. They say that back in the 3rd year of Tian Ji, the population already surpassed 1 million, and the cost of living is high. It's truly a difficult place to get by," Ning Que sighed. Seeing the tension on the little maid's face, he couldn't help but smile and reassure her. "But there's nothing to fear about crowds. Just think of Chang'an as a larger way city. I'll still handle everything outside, and you can simply look after things at home. If it's really overwhelming, you can go out less. We'll live our own little life, just like always. Then, how much will we spend every month just on meat and rice?" Sang Sang pondered aloud, pressing him further. Sang Sang's almond-shaped eyes went wide with worrying as she clutched the hem of her rough cotton skirt, anxiously asking, "Will it really cost more than 4 taels of silver? That's twice as much as what we spend here in Wei City." Ning Que furrowed his brow, pretending to calculate seriously, and replied, "If I actually make it into the academy, you'll have to get me a few decent sets of clothes. Then, when we inevitably have visitors, maybe classmates, or perhaps even a teacher who takes an interest in your master here, we'll at least need 1 set of presentable attire." "Right. By my rough estimate, that would take at least 10 taels of silver." He appeared calm, but he was really just talking nonsense, entirely unaware of what 10 taels might mean to an academy student. 10 taels in Chang'an was likely the cost of a single lavish banquet at a grand tavern, like the joke often told in Hexi about how farmers imagine life at the palace. The Eastern Palace princess baking enormous meat pies as big as the sea, while the Western Palace princess peeled green onions piled up like a mountain. Even with this conservative estimate, Sang Sang was already overwhelmed. She furrowed her brow and looked at Ning Que, her tone almost pleading. "That's too expensive. Ning Que, let's just not go to Chang'an. You don't need to apply to the academy, all right, you clueless girl," Ning Que scolded her, a hint of sternness in his voice. "Once I graduate from the academy, an official post is almost guaranteed. At that point, even if we spend 10 taels a month, I'd be making 70 or 80 taels at the very least. And let's not forget Chang'an's Tian, where there's more rouge and powder than you could ever dream of. Are you really afraid we'll live poorly?" At the mention of rouge and powder, the little maid seemed struck by some private longing, pressing her lips together tightly as she wrestled with her thoughts. After a long silence, she murmured almost inaudibly, "But what will we do during the years you're in the academy? My needlework skills aren't anything special. No one in Chang'an would buy it." "That's true. It could be tricky," Ning Que agreed, recalling how even hunting was off limits in the mountains surrounding Chang'an, as the forests were all imperial property. He paused, then asked, "How much money do we have left?" The two exchanged a glance, then moved in sync to the corner of the room where an old elm-wood chest sat. Lifting its heavy lid, they reached into the most hidden part of the box and carefully pulled out a small, well-wrapped wooden case. Inside lay a scattering of silver shards, each piece no larger than a fingernail and bearing marks from being cut down little by little. In the center was a single large silver ingot, prominent yet thin. Looking at their modest savings, both fell into a silent contemplation. Looking at the scattered bits of silver in the box, neither of them bothered to count it. In a low voice, Sang Sang said, "By our usual rule, we count it every 5 days. We checked it just the night before last. 76 taels, 3 chan, and for fun." Ning Que replied with a serious expression, "Looks like once we're in Chang'an, I'll need to find more ways to make money. I'll work on refining my needlework as much as I can," Sang Sang replied, equally serious, nodding in agreement. Later that night, Sang Sang knelt on the Kong bed, swiftly arranging the bedding. Her thin knees moved quickly across the surface, her nimble hands pressing down on the pillow, just enough to create a slight curve in the center, perfectly suited to the way Ning Que liked to sleep. Once finished, she picked up her own bedding, hopped down, and went to the corner where the 2 large elm-wood chests stood, preparing her own bed for the night. Inside the room, the light went out. Ning Que placed a water bowl on the windowsill and slipped into his bedding, the faint starlight illuminating his contented expression. He stretched his hands over the edge of his blanket, let out a comfortable yawn, then sighed in satisfaction and closed his eyes. Moments later, he heard the familiar soft rustling of Sang Sang arranging her own bed in the corner. It was a sound he'd listened to for years, and its gentle rhythm had come to represent an unparalleled sense of peace. It seemed like any other night of the past years, with Ning Que and Sang Sang drifting to sleep under the starlit border sky. Yet tonight, neither of them truly fell asleep. Perhaps it was the anticipation of stepping into a whole new world, or the allure of Chang'an's distant but beckoning wealth and splendor, or be even a faint curiosity about the city's famed perfumes and powders. Whatever it was, the 2 breaths in the room, one near the window and one in the corner, remained unsettled. After an indeterminate amount of time, Ning Que suddenly opened his eyes, gazing at the faint silvery light filtering through the window paper. In a quiet voice, he said, "They say the girls in Chang'an don't mind the cold. They wear thin clothes with low-cut collars, and their skin is really fair. I wonder if it's true. I was too young back then to remember much." He turned over, looking toward Sang Sang in the dark corner, and asked softly, "Sang Sang, have you been feeling unwell lately? Do you feel cold?" In the darkness, the little maid seemed to shake her head slightly. Clutching the corner of her blanket tightly, her eyes closed, she murmured with a rare smile on her lips, "I've heard the girls in Chang'an really are that fair. With such good powders and perfumes every day, how could they not be?" Ning Que smiled, looking at Sang Sang, and softly said, "Don't worry. Once I have money, you can buy as much of Tianji's rouge and powder as you want." Sang Sang suddenly opened her eyes, her slender, willow leaf-shaped pupils glistening under the starlight. Her expression turned serious as she said, "Ning Que, you promised." "I already said it earlier," Ning Que replied. "Once we get to Chang'an, you'll need to call me young master. That way, it shows respect." 7 or 8 years ago, Ning Que had picked up the cold little Sang Sang from the pile of corpses by the roadside, and after many twists and turns, they had made their way to Viking. Now, 7 or 8 years had passed. Although Sang Sang was officially a maid in the household and did all the work of a maid, she had never called him young master. It wasn't because of anything else. It was simply a habit that had never changed. Today, that habit had to be discarded. "Ning Que, young master." Sang Sang's voice was soft, but her tone was exceptionally firm. "You must remember to buy me Chen Jinju." Ning Que gave a quiet response, his gaze falling to the floor beside the Kong. The white frost-like starlight made his mood tense for no reason. The same feeling of emptiness from years ago surged within him. He turned his head to look at the dark blue night sky outside the window, staring at the countless stars, and murmured softly, "There's still no moon tonight." In the dark corner of the room, Sang Sang curled up in the slightly cool bedding, as quiet as a little mouse. She reached behind her waist and gently tugged, pulling the bedding closer to her body, blocking the chill from the outside and making the gap between the two cabinets less uncomfortable. Listening to Ning Ques's soft murmurs from the window, she silently thought to herself, Ning Que, young master, is talking nonsense again. In the early morning, the master and servant woke up early and began to pack their belongings by the faint morning light. Occasionally, there were some disagreements, but more often, there was a shared, tacit silence. Ning Que rummaged through the dirt wall outside for a long time before finally pulling out a long bag. He carefully checked the bow and arrows inside, ensuring everything was in order, before handing them to Sang Sang. She took the bow and arrows and carefully placed them into a large bundle made of cotton cloth. Next, she retrieved 3 slightly rusted straight swords from beneath the fence. Ning Que took the blades, wiped them carefully a few times, and examined the edges under the rising sun. Satisfied, he nodded and used a piece of rough grass rope to tightly secure the sword to his back. Ning Que then went to the door, took out a large black umbrella, and used the remaining piece of grass rope to bind it, hanging it on Sang Sang's back. The umbrella seemed to be made of some special material, its surface coated in a layer of black grease, making it heavy and non-reflective. The umbrella was quite large, and even when tightened, it almost touched the ground as it hung on Sang Sang's slender frame. Once everything was prepared, Ning Que and Sang Sang walked out from the dilapidated fence. One in front of the other, they stood before the crumbling stone platform, looking back at the humble grass house. Sang Sang looked up at Ning Ques's jaw and asked, "Young master, should we lock the door?" Ning Que paused for a moment before replying softly, "No need to lock it. From now on, we may never return." The iron wooden wheels ground the soft, damp earth as the noble convoy slowly set off, heading outside of Viking. The 5 soft-topped wagons, pulled by horses, were enough to attract attention at any time of year in the borderlands. Today, the crowd by the roadside was particularly lively, but their focus wasn't on the noble horse team, but on the young boy and his little maid sitting in the first wagon. From time to time, someone handed over boiled eggs, or a few women with red faces wiped their tears with dirty handkerchiefs, mumbling something indistinctly. "Ning Que, you little rascal, my distant nephew is so much better, but you wouldn't let Sang Sang marry him. Now look at this. This girl is going with you to those dangerous places, places that devour people without leaving bones behind. I'm telling you, you better take good care of Sang Sang." Sitting on the cart's axle, Ning Que looked displeased and frowned, replying, "Aunt, you started talking about marriage proposals when Sang Sang was just 8 years old. How could that work?" After a few teasing scolds filled with laughter, fine raindrops suddenly began to fall from the sky. The rain, like thin threads, lightly struck everyone's bodies, bringing a slight chill. Despite this, no one in the crowd left. The families of Viking's soldiers were busy bidding farewell to Ning Que, settling the final debts, and the scene was lively with constant chatter. At the back of the procession, the most elaborately decorated wagon had its curtain lifted slightly. A cold, proud maid peeked out, and upon seeing the scene before her, she couldn't help but frown slightly. Just as the convoy was about to leave the small town, Ning Que suddenly stood up and bowed to the people around him. With 3 old swords on his back, he stood in the fine rain, hands clasped in a bow, and his demeanor revealed an unexpected sense of boldness and grandeur. "To all the masters, old and young, and the ladies, I won't say much more in gratitude." After saying this, Ning Que suddenly spread his arms in the fine rain, clenched his fists, and raised them upwards, revealing his not-so-muscular chest and arms, striking a rather awkward pose. Then he shouted loudly, "If I can't make something of myself in Chang'an, I won't come back."